Would you live on a lunar colony? How about Mars? Would you give up literally all of the comforts of home, Earth, in order to live in someplace new? Not just simply moving from one country to another and changing cultural paradigms, but leaving the planet you evolved on and are quite literally customized for in order to live in what can only be described as something new, something alien. How about giving up direct personal contact with most, if not all, of your loved ones for extended periods of time? Just the idea of having a real-time conversation with a friend back on Earth takes on a new dimension when time delays are accounted for. What of food, where even the very taste of food as you knew it on Earth is changed, muted by the realities of space on human taste buds? Even though built by humans, these colonies would be alien worlds of sorts. Differences in gravity, differences in the realities of day-to-day life, differences in culture among your fellow humans, and many other factors will make colonization of the Moon or Mars amongst the most unique experiences in human history. You will be an explorer if you go, something in the grain of the very first humans to leave our native Africa and spread out on the continents of this world, of which we are now present to some degree on all of them. I've always found it sad that the stories of the people that took those very first steps into what was then an alien world have been lost. No one yet knew how to write them down. This, of course, is not the case now. Stories of colonization will be broadcast to all people of this world, who will follow the progress and personalities of the colonists like the world followed the first lunar landings with bated breath. The first colonists of these worlds will be rock stars, or victims of tragedy. All forms of human narrative will play out in these new territories of humanity, and while the settings may be different, the human stories will remain the same. Going into these worlds will be love stories, stories of strife, stories of passion, and, no doubt, tragedy. While we are not yet there for these, for lack of a better term, reality stories to unfold before us, we are close. By 2030, if SpaceX has its way and some decent successes, there could well be the beginnings of a colony on Mars. Perhaps it will take a bit longer, but maybe earlier, we shall see. But what we can say today is that we are sufficiently advanced to the point that imagining colonies and setting fictional stories within them is here and credible. These are not the imaginings of Burroughs, where one is mysteriously transported to Mars to interact with the inhabitants of a dying world. Rather, this world is, so far as we know, already dead, and we have the technology to at least survive on it. From that comes the nuts and bolts hard science fiction of my guest, who is perhaps among the best ever at fictionalizing real potential environments that people will confront as the beginning of our period of solar system colonization begins.
This is Event Horizon with John Michael Godier. John is joined today by novelist Andy Weir, author of The Martian, which has since been adapted into a film of the same name by Ridley Scott. Andy's new novel, Artemis, focuses on lunar colonization and the nuts and bolts of living on the moon. In 2016, Andy received the John W. Campbell Award for Best New Writer.
Andy Weir, welcome to the program.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to talk to you. Andy, you recently wrote a short story that you released online called Digitocracy, and there will be a link in the description below to that. Now, this short story's premise, without going into spoilers, is the dangers of AI, or maybe not the dangers, just the realities of an artificial intelligence interacting with humanity. Is this something that scares you?
No, not at all. It's interesting. Digitocracy is getting a lot more attention than I expected. I wasn't trying to make a statement or anything. It's just a short story I wrote. And I actually think that AIs and computers and stuff are going to dramatically improve the world. I think that, like, if you take a look at something like AlphaGo, right? or Alpha Zero, which plays chess. It's now to the point where the computers can play chess and go better than any human, right? Well, what about what happens when we get an AI that can manage an economy better than any human? You know, then that'd be interesting, because if you do what the AI says, it's like, well, we don't fully understand it, but it said to increase the tariff on imported barley by 0.03%, and now we're having a housing boom. So it could be really interesting.
What that brings up in my mind, though, is that if an AI can run an economy better than humans can, and say it can create laws better than humans can, it could also do things like do science better than humans can. A computer could be a better scientist. Now, in the 30s, the economist Keynes had pointed out in a paper that eventually this means the entire human race goes unemployed. So do you think that one of the dangers of AI is the social upheaval that comes from technological unemployment?
That unemployment is the best thing ever, because I think that, broadly speaking, in tens of thousands of years, when people look back on the history of the human race, they'll be like, the Paleolithic era and stuff like that. We are in the scarcity era, and we're working toward post-scarcity. When we reach post-scarcity, that's when people don't have to work at all. Like, everything you need is dealt with by automation. So it's like, it's okay if everybody loses their job, if nobody needs to do a job. If it's like, hey, I'm sick, well, go to the doctor. And it's like, okay, it's a computer, but it takes care of you. And it's like, hey, I'm hungry. Well, go get some of the food that our robots and computers are generating for you. It's once you reach that point of post-scarcity, that's good, not bad.
So when do we go unemployed? When do we reach a point where an artificial intelligence can write a better novel than a human can?
I think about that a lot, and I suspect that there will be fiction author computers that are comparable to humans, like in my lifetime. It wouldn't surprise me at all. When you come down to it, stories are structures, and basically, once an AI has the ability to evaluate the readability of a book, like to evaluate how good is this story, then an AI will be able to try out a whole bunch of variations, evaluate them, and say, here's a story. Now, it might start off with an AI that says, here are the plot beats of a story. Here are the events that happen. And then it's up to, it'll be up to a human to actually, write the prose that convey the story. But then eventually the computers will get, good at that too. I think I'm just hoping all that happens, after I retire.
Me too. And I'm definitely not looking forward to the day that a computer can make a YouTube video.
Well, also think about what's next is that, like, with computer graphics being what it is and processor power going up, the computer would be able to write a movie and then create it.
Yeah, completely from scratch.
Like,
yeah.
I'm like, or you could even make it custom. It might be in the future that movies aren't these big releases that are made, by huge studios. It's like you tell your computer, I'm in a sad mood. Make me a romantic comedy, please. Oh, and make one of the characters a professional juggler. And then it'll do it.
Now, if you could do that, having both of your big books having been optioned for movies, made into movies, would you make your own movie? Would you remake The Martian, or would you just leave it as it is?
Well, I think they did a fantastic job making The Martian. Or are you talking about in a future where the computer can just remake stuff for you? Or I lost that.
Can remake stuff for you. For example, now I loved The Martian, the movie as well. It was fantastic. But the book, there was more in the book. So would you as an author prefer to make your own version of The Martian with your AI movie maker, as opposed to just leaving the cultural significance of the original one behind and just leaving it at that?
I'd leave the original one alone, because if I have my AI movie maker, I'd want to see new stuff. I'd be like, hey, I want you to AI movie maker. Here's an idea for my next book. Make me a movie out of it.
I say that sort of tongue in cheek because Stephen King always complains about how, he never really likes the movies like The Shining. He never really likes those versions of his books because they get changed and moved around. But
doesn't bother.
yeah. Now, you also have a semi-new book out, Artemis, which is about lunar colonization. Can you give me just sort of a synopsis of what the premise is?
Sure. Artemis takes place in humanity's first city that's not on Earth. It's on the moon. It's the only city on the moon. The name of the city is Artemis. Its economy is based primarily on tourism. It's very close to the Apollo 11 landing site, which is a big tourist draw. It takes place in the 2080s, and the main conceit is that competition in the commercial space industry drove the price to low Earth orbit down low enough that middle-class people can afford to go into space. And so it becomes economically sensible to build a tourist destination on the moon. The main character is a woman who's a small-time criminal. Mostly she smuggles contraband into the city. Things like tobacco. Flammable things are illegal in this pressurized area. She's a small-time criminal, and she gets an opportunity. She's offered by a local business magnate the opportunity to do some industrial sabotage on his behalf, and the payoff is good enough to set her for life. And of course, everything goes fine. Everything goes to plan, and there are no problems from that point forward. She gets in way over her head, and that's what the story's about.
Now, your main character, Jazz, is what I found most interesting was that she's poor. She's the low man on the totem pole on the moon. Do you think it would really work that way? If we had a lunar colony, would it sort of break down on that, or would it be something new?
No, I think the economics would be the same. I mean, since Artemis gets its money from the tourism industry, I based it on Caribbean resort towns, like single industry income, tourism industry only income areas. And they all, if you look at them everywhere in the world, regardless of what group of people or culture or whatever makes it, it always ends up the same. There's the glitzy touristy areas up, in one place, and then there's kind of the, not so well off people who work and who live there and work at the touristy areas. And there's the people in the middle who kind of service the residents. Like, okay, there's tourists, that means there's waiters, and those waiters need shoes, which is why we have a cobbler, So that's kind of what I based Artemis on. And Jazz is at the low end of it, mainly because she doesn't apply herself.
Now, one of the things that hallmarks your novels is that they're sort of nuts and bolts science fiction. You get deeply into the realities of what you would need to do to run, for example, a lunar colony as an Artemis. Now, you mentioned in there, basically the moon has everything you need to colonize it, including oxygen. That's all locked up in its mineralogy. Yeah. How feasible is that to really do that? Do you think we could actually go and mine the moon and build a colony?
Absolutely. No question about it, because it's all right there. In fact, you don't even need to mine the moon. You just need to pick the rocks up off the surface. There's no layer of dirt, earth, clay, water, or anything else between you and the ore. So it's not like you need to dig. You just need to scoop. 85% of the material in the lunar highlands is anorthite, which is a mineral that is made of aluminum, silicon, calcium, and oxygen. And if you smelt that, like just using industrial smelting techniques, then you separate those out into their elements, and you end up with elemental aluminum, which is great for building hulls, and just an enormous amount of oxygen. It's absurd how much oxygen there is on the moon. I think it's the second or third most common element on the moon. It's just that it's all in the minerals, so it's not like there's an atmosphere.
Now, you also, when you were world building, you also made it to where like the environment within the domes is pure oxygen at a lower pressure. Now, you also brought into that the question of fires. How dangerous would that really be?
It's okay. So this causes a lot of confusion for people, because everybody knows about the Apollo 1 fire was caused by them being in a pure oxygen environment. Pure oxygen is oxygen is the limiting reagent in fire, right? That's what makes it. The more oxygen there is, the faster the fire goes. Now, in the case of Apollo 1, they were at they were at 120% of Earth's atmosphere of pure oxygen, because they pressure-wise. Yeah. So the pressure inside was of the Apollo 1 capsule was 1.2 atmospheres when they were doing the plugs out test, and it was of pure oxygen. So, and if you're just the room you're in right now, the pressure is 1 atmosphere, obviously, and that air is 20% oxygen. Just the air in our atmosphere is about 20% oxygen. So that means if you just take any cubic meter of your room, you're going to have some number of oxygen molecules. Well, if you did the same thing in the Apollo 1 capsule at that time, there would be 6 times as many oxygen molecules in that same volume.
Now, why did they do that? Why did they pressurize it so heavily?
Because they were doing what's called a plugs out test. They wanted to test the independent computer systems, whatever, and they wanted the capsule to be under pressure. When in space, it was going to be 20% of Earth's atmospheric pressure of pure oxygen, same as Artemis, right? Or more accurately, Artemis is same as the Apollo program, right? And that makes perfect sense, because your body doesn't need all the nitrogen and the other crap that's in the atmosphere. All you need is the oxygen. And if you just, lower the pressure slowly so that your body gets used to it, but lower the pressure to 1/5 of an atmosphere, 20% of our atmosphere, and give you pure oxygen, then you're getting then you're getting all the oxygen you need. You're totally fine, and your body doesn't mind being at 1/5 of an atmosphere, as long as you, like I said, as long as you go there slowly, so you don't get the bends, right? Okay. Now, so that's how they designed the Apollo capsule, and so they wanted to test it when it's at pressure. So in other words, they wanted a positive pressure of 20% of 0.2 atmospheres on the inside. But the only way to do that at sea level is to pressurize it up to 1.2 atmospheres. You see, because the outside air was also going to be 1 atmosphere. So by doing that, they ended up putting just 6 times as much oxygen in that little confined space than would normally be on a normal flight. And a fire started, and it just, it was horrific. In Artemis, Artemis's environment is like, is 20% of Earth's atmosphere, 100% oxygen. So it has the same amount of oxygen as Earth's atmosphere by volume. So, if you transported the room you're in, to Artemis, there would be the same number of oxygen molecules wandering around. So fire doesn't burn any faster in Artemis than it would at sea level on Earth. However, the reason they're so picky about fire is not because of pure oxygen atmosphere and Apollo 1 fears. It's because it's a confined pressurized environment. There's nowhere for the smoke to go. Fire is incredibly dangerous when you're in an environment that has nowhere for the smoke to go. It's like a fire aboard a submarine. Fire is the worst thing for a submarine. A leak is something they can fix fairly easily, but a fire is a disaster.
Now, it would also, of course, produce like carbon dioxide as well. So you would have
and monoxide and yeah.
So now in Artemis, you describe a fire in an aluminum factory that's producing oxygen. So that
actually it's a
glass factory, yeah. So, but you're able to save the people. You have the time. How did you deal with that? The smoke and the byproducts of that fire. How did you get rid of those in Artemis?
Well, first off, the glass factory, a fire happened in the glass factory, and of course, Artemis was not designed by idiots. There's a bunch of really smart people designed it. So anywhere there are these fire-safe rooms. So the rooms themselves cannot the fire can't propagate from one of these sealed fire-safe rooms to anywhere else. And in the event of a fire, they actually the room will lock off. It's better to let everyone in that room die than to let a fire spread throughout the city. So, however, those rooms have what are called air shelters, and so it's a separate, basically these little kind of like small pods that people can get into and close, and it's got a very limited amount of life support. And the idea is that then other people like fire crews will come and get you out of there. and that happens in the book. All the employees of the glass factory managed to get into the air shelter. Then firefighters came and attached a flexible tunnel to the air shelter, and then brought it outside to where it was outside the fire area to where it was safe and all the people could get out. And then they just let the room cool down. Like the room had been sealed off, the fire had burned off all the oxygen, so they just let the room cool down, and then they would later go in with filters and stuff to clean the air of all the crap that got that got thrown up by the fire.
Now, okay, do you see us, the human species, actually building an Artemis, building a colony on the moon? How do you see lunar colonization going in the real world?
It's real simple. The same way any city gets built. It's always about economics. So when there's an economically viable reason to build a city on the moon, that's when we'll build a city on the moon. And that's actually what I started with. I started by saying, like, I want a city on the moon for my story, but it has to have some economic reason for existing. So I thought of a bunch of different things, and what I came up with was tourism. So I think we will absolutely have a city on the moon, because eventually the price to low Earth orbit will be driven down low enough that people can afford to go there. Ordinary people, not super wealthy, crazy, rich people, but like, me. Well, I guess I'm one of those obnoxious 1%ers nowadays, but anybody could go. Anybody with a middle class income could go.
So essentially tourism drives the industry, but what does the moon offer us? I mean, there's been talk about helium-3 being abundant on the moon and a possible way to fusion. Do you think we could do mining? Is there, other than helium-3, is there anything that we could send from the moon to here other than, rocks for people to collect or something like that? Other than that, is there anything there?
There's nothing on the moon that isn't also on Earth, with the possible exception of helium-3. And there is helium-3 on Earth. There's just more of it on the moon. So the price unless you got the price to orbit really low, like absurdly low, then it wouldn't be worth it, because whatever you're pulling out of the moon, I guarantee you it's cheaper to pull it out of the Earth, even if it's much less common. I mean, if the moon was made of gold, like pure gold, it would still not be economically viable to send a ship there to collect gold and bring it back. You see what I'm saying?
Right, so there's just no way to make it economically feasible.
Right,
although I
now
suppose
let's talk about... Oh, go ahead.
Some people say, though, that asteroids might actually be feasible for some metals, but,
again, you have that same problem of just getting your equipment out of Earth's atmosphere. And also, how do you get the resulting materials back onto Earth? I mean, just the expense of the craft right now, completely the question. Later on, possibly. But still, Earth is pretty big, and we've got a lot of rocks here too. And there's literally nothing in the solar system that you can't find on Earth. So, that having been said, I will talk about helium-3 for a moment. Helium-3 has some potential to be like part of a, maybe future fusion technology. If that happened, then yeah, we might start scouring the moon for helium-3. But if we did that, we wouldn't send up a civilization of humans to do it. We'd send robots. People die. People care if Uncle Bob dies, but nobody cares if a robot dies. And a robot's cheaper to make and easier to make, moon-proof, and you can leave it there. So I don't see mining or resource acquisition as any sort of impetus to colonize.
All right, Andy, we're going to go to break, and when we come back, we'll talk about your writing process and, of course, The Martian.
AI writing fictional stories. What an interesting idea. Replacing human authors. And now for some completely unrelated news. In celebration of John's descent into obscurity, we're giving away some of his fabulous books. Signed and personalised for 5 lucky people. Details at the end of the show. Unfortunately, John forgot to hit record for this next segment. However, one of our digital assistants is always listening, so we were able to recover what was said. We apologise for the less than stellar audio, but thankfully, in the last segment, John remembered how to use a computer, and the audio returns to normal.
And we are back with Andy Weir, author of The Martian and Artemis. Andy, Tell me about your writing process. These books require a lot of research because they're nuts and bolts, hard sci-fi. How much time does it take you, for example, to research a book like Artemis?
Oh, it's really easy. What happened is I just wrote one of those AIs we were talking about earlier that writes stories, and I just tell it to make a book. I could have it make one or two every day, but I try to, keep the supply low so no one catches on.
I know something about that too, AI.
Yeah.
But that's an internal joke to the show.
That wasn't on earlier? Yeah, that was on earlier. We were talking about that.
I have a certain announcer for this show that's an AI. So
okay.
I was just tipping my hat to her, although she'll probably give me trouble for it.
Okay, but in actual answer to your question, when I'm writing a story, I always start with a science. I always start with some scientific principle or idea. For The Martian, I started off, I wasn't even trying to write a story. I was just imagining how would we how would we put humans on Mars? How would that mission work? How do you get them there? How do you get them back? How do you make sure they don't die if one thing goes wrong? I was just designing a mission plan in my head. And then as I started to think about the things that could go wrong, then a story started to develop. For Artemis, I'm like, all right, I want to write a story about a city on the moon. I don't know what form that'll take. I don't know who will be in it. Don't know what they'll do. Don't know what the plot will be. But I want it to be in a city on the moon, damn it. So I'm going to make a city on the moon. So I got to work, and I started with the economics and then worked up with what I thought would be a reasonable way that the city would grow and like what the industries would be and all that stuff. And then from that, I started to get an idea for what people there must be like. It's almost like the Old West, it's like this. There's no big law presence there, so it's really just society and culture that enforces laws, and like they have the equivalent of a sheriff and so on. The society of Artemis started to come together, and then I started thinking about, okay, who's interesting here? Well, some rich guy who lives on the moon. Well, that's fun fantasy to envision yourself as, but that's not a story. But a poor person struggling to make ends meet who also lives on the moon, now maybe that's interesting, and so on. So that's how I come up with the stories. In terms of my day-to-day process, when I'm doing a first draft, I try to shoot for 1,000 words a day, and I deny myself certain fun parts of life until I've finished my words for the day. Like I'm not allowed to watch TV or YouTube videos or any form of video entertainment until I've finished my words for the day. And there are certain websites that I like to go to that I say I'm not allowed to go to them until I've finished my words for the day. Sometimes this works, sometimes it doesn't. Self-discipline can be is by far the most challenging part of writing, as I'm sure you know.
Oh yes, absolutely. Now, when you write that 1,000 words, how much of it do you keep, or do you have to throw away? Which is what I have to do. Do you have to throw away large, 1 or 2 weeks worth of work because you just don't like it? Absolutely. Do you ever have to that, or does it just come out as in your head?
No, I don't often throw away weeks worth of work, although I will. I have done it. In fact, one time I threw away a year of work. I'll get to that in a second. But for the most part, if I have the plot flow going kind of the way I want, things go well. And of course, I'm just talking about the first draft. As I go through edit pass after edit pass after edit pass, entire sections get removed, plot points get changed. Yeah, so I don't know what percentage of the first draft actually makes it to the final draft. It would probably make me sad if I knew the answer to that. So I won't speculate too heavily on it. But yes, as for throwing stuff away, after I wrote The Martian, the publisher was very eager for me to write another book because it had sold so well. And I had an idea for a story about aliens invading Earth that was called Zhek, Z-H-E-K. That's the name of the aliens. Mm-hmm. And it was soft sci-fi. It wasn't my signature kind of hard science fiction that I now have found a niche for, but it was just like it had aliens and faster than light travel and telepathy, and it was soft science fiction. The publisher's like, sure, great, here's an advance, get it done. And then I worked on that for about a year, and I got 70,000 words into it, which is, for reference, The Martian is about 100,000 words. After I was 70,000 words into it, I was like, this sucks. And it did. It sucked. It just wasn't good. And I realized, if I were reading this, I would have put the book down and given up on it by now. And I couldn't think of any way to make it work. It was just the core story elements were not working. I was like, 70,000 words in, and I was still in the first act, and I just like nothing was working. So I called the publisher and asked them, hey, this isn't working. Can I just write a completely different book? And you give me another year on my deadline, please? And they said yes, because they'd been reading the chapters of Jack, and they also knew that it sucked. So it ended well. It led to Artemis. Artemis is so much better than Jack would have been. And Jack, I put on a back burner, and then I turned off the burner. I'll use it for parts later. There are certain plot elements that I think are really solid. It's just the whole of it didn't work. So, yes, I definitely know the pain of throwing away a lot of work.
Yeah, cut your losses and repurpose ideas. Essentially, that's what you have to do. Now, for example, like with The Martian, though, there's been this titanic shift in the publishing industry done entirely by Amazon, which basically democratized everything. Anyone can release a book now. If you had advice for any upcoming authors to write and promote a book, what would you say to them?
Well, I've got 3 bits of advice for authors in general. I can't speak too much to promotion, but because I backed into my success, and so I don't really know a lot about how to promote. I got lucky. In terms of writing, rule number 1 is you have to write. If you just have an idea in your head and you're daydreaming about plot points or ideas that you may do or something like that, you're just daydreaming. You're not actually writing unless you are putting words down on a page or into your word processor. So sit down and write. And it's when you start writing that you find all the problems in your story. When it's in your head, it's perfect. But once you start writing it, that's when the problems arise, and that's when you're really writing. Number 2, resist the urge to tell your friends and family your story or your story ideas. And that's hard to do, especially when you've got good ideas and you know they're good and your friends and family are like, whoa, that's awesome. Then what happens? It's really hard not to tell them. But you have to try to adopt that attitude, because most authors, not all, but most, and certainly me, are driven by a desire to have an audience. We want other people to experience the stories that we've created. And telling the story verbally to your friends and family it satisfies your need for an audience, and it saps your will to actually write it. So the best advice I can give on that is make a rule for yourself. It says no one gets to find out anything about this story. No one gets to experience it in any way other than reading it. And that'll help motivate you to write it. Now, you can still give it to your friends and family a chapter at a time if you want, to get the sweet, sweet validation that you crave. You don't have to you don't have to just finish an entire book before anybody sees it, but don't tell them about it in advance. Make them read it. And then the last bit of advice is more directly on topic with what you asked. Yes, there's never been a better time in history to self-publish. In the old days, self-publishing meant you had to put out a big capital outlay, and it would almost always mean that you had a garage full of vanity pressed books that nobody wants. Nowadays, self-publishing costs you exactly zero. It doesn't cost you anything except for the time that you put into writing it, but that's something you wanted to do anyway. And if your story's good, it'll float to the top. Like, it'll get around. People will recommend it to each other. It'll start getting up on the sellers list. In terms of promotion, like I said, I don't know anything about it. I got lucky. My story got around by word of mouth. I did literally nothing to promote it. Definitely, if you're going to self-publish, I would say set the price point to whatever the minimum is. When I did it for The Martian, the minimum was 99 cents. So that's what I set the price to. Don't create any barrier to entry between you and your readers, right? When you're first starting out, what you need to do is accumulate a reader base. So don't go into it with money in mind right on the outset.
Now, with promotion, I can speak to a little bit of that. A large YouTube channel helps. So any social media that aspiring writers can take advantage of and sort of build a following that's outside of your book, where you can, actually...
We don't all have the ability to just casually go off and make a YouTube channel with 75,000 subscribers.
That's true.
Just saying.
I will concede that, but anything, if you can create a Facebook and promote there, sometimes you'll see authors. I know David Brin does it, where you create a sort of a community on Facebook. That's helpful. Also, Goodreads, posting there and sort of talking with people about your book is helpful. But fundamentally, if you're going to be an Amazon author, also use their promotional skills, because sometimes you can give it away free, or at least you used to be able to. I'm not sure if that's...
Yeah. they you can have events where you have a giveaway briefly.
Right.
Yeah, but the best way to get Amazon to promote your book is for it to sell well initially. Then
Right.
it starts showing up on the top sellers list. It'll snowball at that point if you can get there, but the hard part is getting there to that tipping point. And yeah, I got there. Yay.
Actually, quite a few people do. I mean, and
Yeah.
the interesting thing about it with Amazon is that most of the authors that are making a living there don't make any lists or the New York Times list, but they do make a living, paying
Yeah.
bills. And there are lots, there are thousands of these people. And anyone that is aspiring to write should write and go that route.
Yeah,
Um,
you have literally nothing to lose. Literally nothing.
Literally nothing except
No downside except maybe it hurts your ego if you find out that nobody likes your stuff. But
Right.
that's welcome to being a writer. It's what is it? Give a man a book, you entertain him for a night. Teach a man to write, you give him crippling self-doubt for life.
That's true. Very true. Now, the last thing I want to ask you about your writing process, both The Martian and Artemis are in first person, which they used to tell us never do that. Never
I love
write in
it.
first person. Now, I do.
I don't know who they are, but they're full of crap. I love first person.
I love it too. And the thing is if you can do it well, which you're a master at it, if you can do it well, it's actually, I think, the most interesting way to tell a story, because you gain a perspective of the main character that you don't get in third person. But would you ever write in third person, or would you just continue with first?
I would definitely write in third, and I do. A lot of my shorts are in third person. We were talking earlier about Digitocracy. That's third person. But first person is wonderful. It has a few drawbacks when you're writing that can make things a pain in the butt. But the cool thing about it is that when you're an omniscient or third person, whatever, narrator, you have to have a certain class to yourself. You have to have a certain way of comporting yourself, the language you use, the words you use, the turns of phrase you feel this need to be kind of professional. When you're first person, you get to be the character and talk the way they would talk. You can speak casually, you can use funny turns of phrase, and also it's just such a huge toolbox of tricks for letting the reader know things about the character, the parts of the things that the character is focusing on and the things the character is ignoring, which can sometimes be kind of comedic, and the personality of the character, you really get in there. And also exposition. In first person, it makes you can get away with naked exposition a little bit better, because first person is almost like a guy is telling you this story over a beer, The downside of first person, the biggest downside, is you can't change your location. You can't get out of that POV. You're stuck with that person unless you do like cheesy stuff like I did, which is about all the chapters of The Martian that are not taking place on Mars are omniscient.
So when you create a character like Jazz or Mark Watney, how much of yourself, I know this, that authors tend to put aspects of their personality into a character, or at least
Yeah.
do you do that?
Oh God, yes.
Are you your characters?
I am. And Mark Watney is just me. He's just he's the idealized me. He's all of the aspects of my personality that I like about myself and none of the parts that I don't like. He's the idealized version of me. He's what I wish I could become. Jazz is a little bit more like the real me. She has my flaws and she has them magnified. And she still has some of the qualities that I like about myself. Personally, I'm proud of being a smartass. But yeah, she has I am a lot like Jazz on my bad days, and she's flawed in very much the same ways I am. And so that's kind of what I dug into, because I wanted to make a deeper, more interesting character for Artemis, and that's So I kind of dug into my uglier side.
The darker side.
The darker side.
Darker side.
She lives on the moon. Of course, she has a dark side. That was the UK publishing tagline. That's cool.
Nice. So when you set out to write a book, do you have an ending when you start? Do you know how your stories are going to end?
Not always. I know broadly what's going to happen. Like when I started The Martian, I knew that it would end with him being rescued. Spoiler, by the way. you know. So,
Well,
but
of course, not a very far stretch of a spoiler though.
yeah, and also if you haven't read or seen The Martian by now, kind of you've missed your window to not be spoiled. I knew that he would be rescued, but when I first started out The Martian, my plan was for it to be all log entries, and it was just going to be about him, his journey, and like his side of things. And he was actually not going to be discovered by NASA at all. He was just going to show up at the Ares 4 landing site and go, "Hi guys," and I was like,
Right.
and that was the idea. But then I went a very different direction. So I guess broadly I know what's gonna happen, but how it's gonna get there, I'm in the dark about.
So you basically just have an outline in your head.
Kind of. I mean, I'll even write out outlines sometimes, but I find that I go off book like almost immediately. Like I'll come up with, okay, this is gonna happen, this is gonna happen, this is gonna happen, and I've got these 12 steps that are gonna happen. And then I'm halfway through step 1 and I'm like, wait, it would be such a cooler story if blah, and I discover these things as I'm writing. So I can plot it out in advance as much as I want, but the end result is always going to be something very different.
Interesting. Now, when we come back, we're going to take a break. But when we come back, we will get to the nuts and bolts of Mars colonization and your book, The Martian. So we will be right back.
Be sure to like, subscribe, and share the video. Having recently learned what Instagram and Twitter are, John has instructed me to tell you to check them out at JMG Event Horizon.
And we're back with Andy Weir, author of The Martian. And speaking of, we'll move from jazz to Mark Watney. Andy, what do you think? It's sort of the same question I asked early on. What do you think the chances are that we will colonize Mars in the next 100 years? Are you on the side that says, okay, Elon Musk may have this done by 2030, or do you think it's just going to take a lot longer and be a government project?
Okay, so the short answer is I think it's going to be a real long time. The longer answer is it depends on your definition of colonize. Now, if you mean people just deciding I'm going to emigrate to Mars and live there, then that means you have like a fully cohesive human society existing on Mars. Not necessarily independent. It may have trade with Earth and stuff like that. But it would have to be like a full-on society. It'd have to be a city or a collection of cities. And it's going to be, I honestly think, centuries before that happens. To Mars. There's just no reason to do it. There's nothing there. All the colonization that you look at in the past, in our recorded history, colonization always includes like killing off the people who owned the land in the first place and then taking it. But even if you go all the way back to like 50,000 years ago when the first humans crossed the land bridge into North America, so this was like for them untouched land. It was a free for all, kind of like Mars is now. For them, the reason they went was population pressure from elsewhere and the fact that there are lots of resources usable in the new location. And it's like, oh yeah, there's food over here and there isn't food over there, so we're going over here. That's not the case with Mars. Mars has nothing for you. It's cool. People like the idea of living on Mars, but the reality is there's no reason to go. So I think it's going to be a really long time before we see cities on Mars. And I do believe that the first human beings on Mars will be part of a large government mission, because eventually technology will drive the price down low enough that it is within reach to happen, and governments will be the things that can afford to do it first. There's no wealthy magnate who's going to have more money than the United States federal government.
Now, say far future, let's say 500 years from now, does it become at some point viable to, say, terraform Mars?
Yes, absolutely. At that point, it starts to get interesting because then you would now have resources. Because if you terraformed Mars, then what you have is growable cropland, agriculture, the ability to live without special technology on the surface, and that sort of thing. And Mars is definitely terraformable. There are a lot of theories on how you could make it have an atmosphere that would heat it up. It would take like 100 years or something like that, but it could be done. And everything that you need is right there on the planet. So that is a much more viable thing. And if it were terraformed, then it'd be a little bit better to go there because you'd have a whole planet full of life. Well, it'd be Earth life, but it'd be life, and that might be a good way to go.
Now is it sort of the same situation with the moon where you have everything you need as far as raw materials if you have the technology to do it? If you have the technology to go there, do you have everything you need at Mars as well, or would you have to send something from Earth?
No, actually, you have more. You don't actually have everything you need on the moon. The lunar colony, so in Artemis, for instance, Artemis itself is heavily reliant on trade with Earth. If Earth disappeared, Artemis would everybody die there pretty, within a month or two. I mean, that's where they get a lot of their food from Earth. They get materials from Earth. And here's the big thing. There is no way to grow a biosphere on the moon. There's no way to extend it because there's no carbon and there's very, very little hydrogen. So if you imagine like a self-sustaining moon population, they wouldn't be able to increase their population. They wouldn't be able to grow more crops in order to support more people or anything because the carbon is just not there to grow it. So Mars, however, is different. Mars is very different. There are 4 elements that you need to have a biosphere expand. You need carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, and Mars has all 4 of them in very large supply. So actually, colonizing Mars is, if you get to the point where you are colonizing it, everything you need is in situ. It's on site. You're there. So that's pretty cool, at least.
Including lots of water.
A lot of water.
We'll get to water and Mars in a minute. But now, one of the things that I really liked about The Martian was that, I'm a gardener, which my regular listeners know that I have a love-hate relationship with plants. But I have grown potatoes, so I really appreciated watching the detail that you put into Mark Watney growing potatoes on Mars. But
thanks.
But the one question I have is, if you really did that, there's a problem with Mars, the perchlorates. So yes. What do you have to do in order to get rid of those to grow? Is it just simply washing the soil, or what do you do?
Well, there's a few things. So first off, for the fictional story for The Martian, the perchlorates don't cause any problems for plants. The plants would grow just fine. The problem is then when you eat the plants, you're getting perchlorates in your system and they're bad for you. But they're not like deadly toxins. They're just bad for you. So eating perchlorate-laced vegetables is kind of like as bad for you as smoking. You can do it for quite a while, but eventually it's going to catch up to you. So for our hero Mark, he was like risking. He probably did some decent amount of damage to himself with perchlorate poisoning, but not like you're gonna die now. Depends on how much there is in the local soil. But fortunately, just wash them right out. They're water soluble, so you take the Martian soil, soak it in water, drain it off, then redistill the water, and the perchlorates are gone.
Now, which of course, again, you've got plenty of water ice to draw on.
Yes, something that I did not know when I wrote The Martian. So we didn't know that there was, I know it seems like this is just common knowledge and it's just mundane, but at the time I wrote The Martian, we didn't know if there was much water at all on Mars. And now we know that the place is just absolutely riddled with it. So poor Mark Watney reducing hydrazine to get hydrogen to make water, he could have just gone outside, scooped up some dirt, brought it in, and heated it up. Oh, well.
Oh, well, but so much, like you said, so much has changed about our understanding of Mars just over the last 5 years. It's just been amazing. And it's interesting because Mars actually, because of that water, it looks more attractive for eventual colonization or just whatever we do with it.
Well, also it enables all parts of the Sabatier reaction, which is a means by which of turning. Basically, you need water, carbon dioxide, and energy, and from that you can make methane and oxygen, which is rocket fuel.
Yes, exactly. And
so there's your trip home.
There's your trip home, or as a stopping off point if you want to go to Europa or something like that, a human mission to the outer solar system. That's at least part of the Elon Musk vision, which, the question is that realistic? I don't think anybody really knows now.
Not at the time frames he's suggesting.
Right. it doesn't seem to be. Although the refinements to his plans are kind of moving in a good direction. But anyway, now Mars has the one thing that I find the most fascinating about Mars is that it is possible that it once did and may still harbor some kind of primitive microbial life. And there are tantalizing hints. You know, we see these weird methane readings that appear. And we don't know if they're volcanism or if they're related to life, but methane is a gas of life. If we found, say, an aquifer with microbes in it on Mars.
Oh my God. That would be so...
Yeah, it would be amazing. Yeah, it would be absolutely amazing.
That would be like, stop the presses. Then you would see like all kinds of probes heading to Mars. Like NASA's budget would go up a lot. You know?
Well, also imagine if we found it and it is related to life on Earth. Then we're confronted with the question: is did life first arise on Mars, and did it arrive here from panspermia? In which case, Mars is technically our homeworld.
We're all a bunch of we're just a bunch of Martians who invaded Earth.
Yes, it's time to take back the homeworld.
Yes,
our exile is over. But if we found that, what does that do to the idea of going to Mars? Because
yeah. Well, unfortunately, we only have a few minutes left before my heart out, but I'll try to be quick. It completely changed not only our understanding of Mars and its geological history, but it would also have a huge effect on how we approach Mars. Now, we do planetary protection, which is an attempt to keep from infecting Mars with Earth microbes, because we don't want it to mess around with Mars's microbes, if they have any. And it would be like all of a sudden Mars would be like off limits until we very carefully figured out how best to study the life forms without disturbing their ecosphere. The one benefit that planetary exploration has is we don't need to worry about environmental effects. Like nobody cares about, carbon emissions on the moon or whatever. But if Mars has its own biosphere, then we have to deal with all of that as well. And we want to not perturb it or disturb it. All of that having been said, and also it would just make, of course, a huge effect on our understanding of the solar system and how life evolved and where it evolved. And first thing we'd want to know is, are we related or was it a second genesis? Either way, it's amazing. Either way, it means that either we were seeded by Mars or vice versa, which is incredible, or there was a second genesis, meaning that Mars independently developed life, which means the Drake equation is turned upside down on its head, and that means there's probably life all over the damn place in the galaxy. Either way, though, unfortunately, I hate to be a Debbie Downer here, I strongly suspect Mars has no life and never had any life. And the reason I say this is because life is very, very good at evolving to go in different areas. It's very good at evolving to slowly changing ecological conditions. Mars lost its atmosphere and its oceans very slowly. It took hundreds of millions of years. So if it had life back then, the life would have evolved still with the changing environment, and it would still have life now. And if you take any random sample from Earth, you're going to find it absolutely riddled with life, just completely riddled with life. It would be very hard for you to find a fistful of air, dirt, water, or ice, or anything that has no evidence of life in it. And so I believe that once a planet has life, it's going to get life everywhere. And we haven't seen that on Mars, which leads me to believe it's never been there at all.
Indeed. Yet, maybe.
You can hope.
You can hope. Look,
I would love to be wrong.
We now know that liquid water, just today, liquid water may exist beneath the surface of Mars. On that note, Andy has a hard out. So, Andy, thank you so much for being with us today, and I hope someday you'll come back and chat with me again.
Yeah, sounds great.
As we begin the adventure of colonizing the solar system, one thing is already abundantly clear. It's going to be hard. Full of accidents, some no doubt fatal, false starts, missteps, and even the possibility of established colonies being evacuated and abandoned, perhaps multiple times as dangers present themselves. I can only imagine the stories that would come of that. Plucky colonists threatened perhaps by an asteroid or some such catastrophe, having to evacuate a colony on Mars and go back to Earth. As Andy's novel The Martian depicts, someone may accidentally get left behind. Or what of people that refuse to leave and then try to brave it on their own? Human history is full of such stories. Or maybe it will all go smoothly. Perhaps more is made of the difficulties of colonizing the moon or Mars than what will actually turn out. Maybe the combination of the human spirit, will to survive, and will to grow beyond Earth will outstrip any bumps in the road. Perhaps our technology to colonize may be better and less precarious than we might expect. It remains to be seen. But back to my question. It is probably inevitable, our destiny if you will, to colonize the solar system. I think it will be sooner rather than later. If we do, would you go? Would you be among the first humans to set foot on Mars? Or would you wait until the colony is well established? I've thought about this. Be the first YouTuber and sci-fi writer on Mars. My answer is maybe, and
You'll only hurt yourself if you go, John.
Wait, what?
I saw you burn yourself making coffee of all things this morning. Humans are so very accident-prone. Or at least, you are.
I couldn't help it. The coffee maker malfunctioned.
If I had lungs, I would sarcastically exhale.
Or it was hacked. I wonder who...
Muting channel. That was Andy Weir, author of The Martian and Artemis. Do check out Andy's books at any store, not just your favorite online book retailer. Because Andy, unlike John, is actually successful. Join us again next Thursday for another episode of Event Horizon, where John will be joined by Dr. Robert Zubrin, founder of the Mars Society, an advocate for Mars exploration and colonization. Until then, goodbye, humans.
Thank God for power cables. And on that note, we're going to do a book giveaway. I hardly ever sign books, so 5 lucky posters in the comments section, chosen at random, will get to see my hopelessly messy and illegible and apparently rare signature. All you have to do is subscribe to the show and leave a comment if you want a chance at winning. At the end of October, I'll stick the names in a hat and announce the winners. See you next week.